My name is Aisen Chacin, and I lead a medical prototyping lab at the University of Texas Medical Branch, where I'm also assistant professor of School of Medicine. And I also am an adjunct professor in the School of Art at the University of Houston. And I come from an art background. I studied studio arts in my undergrad, and then design and technology, Masters of Fine Arts, and a PhD in human informatics at the University of Tsukuba in Japan. My work oscillates between art and science, and also BioArt, which you may have already a pretty good idea of what that is, especially after Adam's talk. Really, it started in the 80s with Joe Davis, and it's a lot of microbiology and genetics, but I consider BioArt to be more extensive to anatomy and assistive technology as well. And my work is also very much into device art, which is a concept that started in Japan in 2004. And it's a form of art that brings about the essence of technology through new materials and mechatronic devices. It has three characteristics. The device itself is the content. The mechanism represents the theme of the piece. Content and tool are no longer separable. Artworks are often playful and can sometimes be commercialized into devices or gadgets for use of everyday life. And then refined design and playful features are tracked back to the Japanese tradition of appreciating tools and materials. And so Hiro Iwata is the lead of device art, and he's also my sensei from my PhD. And oops, sorry. Here is one of his works called The Floating Tiles, and what they do is that they put you back in the same place where you started. So as you step, they robotically move you back to the same place. It used to be a video, but I don't know. So here's another work from Hiro Iwata, and it's called The Floating Eye, and it's a zeppelin that has a camera and then a helmet that allows you to change your perspective. And so now you're able to see yourself within your own field of view. And so human capabilities are limited by the obstacles of our physical condition. Whereas our mind roams free in the realm of endless possibilities in our imagination. The ambition to extend our senses, bodies, reach, and even lifespan is embedded in the very DNA that tells our evolutionary history. We are adaptable beings capable of surviving and thriving in all because of our relentless ingenuity. Our extension begins from understanding the very axons that propel our neuromotor control, dividing and conquering information through crowdsourcing, sharing digital workspaces to the abstract ideas of device art. Our devices have made us transformable beings, a large connected organism of individuals, each a node capable of transferring any thought in a single tap or click to the rest of our connected humanity. Devices distinguish us from other animals, they make us human. And I'd like to say that, whereas Adam is talking about eros as a factor for adaptation, and I believe the same as well. And I think that devices are an example of that, that we are evolving with the materials that we have at hand and incorporating them in order to kind of live different realities and propel the adaptation of our bodies consciously through the desire of what we want to see or experience. So the human-technology relationship, Sigmund Freud said, with every tool, man is perfecting his own organs, whether motor or sensory, or is removing the limits to their functioning. So we're in this kind of era of the quantified self. It's been happening for a long time now, that we are using body data as entertainment, as capital, and it's an example of our co-evolutionary awareness. So we are finally consciously evolving. We are our machines evolve with us. And so for me, it's a co-evolutionary awareness. And so medical devices and diagnostic tools are being worn as fashionable accessories that keep track of our biosignals, heart rate, perspiration, and even now oxygen levels as well. And users have a new intimate scope by which to learn more about themselves. And so we're hyper aware of our physical condition and constantly monitoring and kind of interacting with it. So consumers, as consumers embrace this commodification of the quantified self, they're eager to adopt new sensory avenues by which to enhance their physiological mechanisms. So I don't think that it's just, art. I think that we're all kind of, as a species, looking into this just naturally as a way to continuously enhance ourselves and evolve. The growing interest in biometrics-oriented devices is an exemplary phenomena to the motives that drive co-adaptive computing experiences and the interactive design of cognizant human evolution. So this eager adoption provides an outlook on the direction in which humans are co-evolving with their machines and reveals the collective yet intimate demand for experiential intensification. So I think that even before we are making devices just as living things, we are constantly looking for experiential intensification. We just want to see further. We want to, maybe not smell more, except only after some anosmia from COVID or something like that. Now we're thinking about the sense of smell or bed chemoreception. But there's this demand for experiential intensification. You can see how we adopt technology for audio-visual, realities, alternate realities, and so on. And so this phenomena of electric enhancement to the body make some forms of disability maybe desirable. This is Rob Spence, who's a good friend of mine, and he is Iborg. He's a documentary filmmaker that lost one of his eyes, and he worked with Dr. Ling in Scotland to create a camera for his eye. And so this makes me question, at which extent are we willing to modify our bodies to incorporate technology that is enhancing us, but at the same time is maybe temporarily disabling us or is permanently disabling us? And so really it's this question of ability, right? Why do we consider one ability more important than the other? Or what is disability? Is all of these questions of how can we gain new sensibilities without the danger of loss? And is this necessary? Maybe we do want to lose something. So how is this coming into the consumer public, right? Are we willing to become more disabled to gain other insight? I would say yes. We are constantly now disabling ourselves with the bright screens. I don't know if you ever remember your parents being like, don't sit right in front of the TV. I mean, I'm like constantly on this tiny TV, right? So we are consciously deciding to disable ourselves and weaken our eyesight in order to be in this connected reality, which is so much more valuable than, this purest eyesight, because obviously we have devices for that, the beautiful eyeglasses a lot of you are wearing now. These are assistive technologies that are kind of a sign of mild disability, but at the same time it's fashionable. Maybe you even look smarter. You look like a professor, right? So when you're wearing them. So this is a really interesting dichotomy of what is disability, what is desire, and how far are we willing to change our bodies? And obviously we're consciously doing this. So human adaptability is guided by this technological co-evolution that we are absolutely aware of. So my work really is in trying to learn how to make assistive technology that is maybe not necessarily you know, replacing a sense. Here is an example of what I would call assistive device art. Here's the third arm of Stellark. And as you can see, he has a third arm. Obviously, this isn't a prosthetic because nobody has a third arm, but it totally looks like a prosthetic. Then we can go into more invasive assistive technology. And so what if we needed to, you know, if we had our ears in our arms where we could, or in our hands where we could move them around and actually decide what to listen to, or, you know, have an easier time covering our ear, or maybe having, you know, better triangulation because, you know, we only have two, so we have stereo hearing, but maybe with the third one we could better locate things because of three, triangulation. And yeah, we are obviously consciously evolving, and this is what Adam was talking about when female sperm is now being created. This is the work of Charlotte Jarvis, and she has worked with a team of geneticists to create sperm from pluripotent cells. And so now that we can make pluripotent cells from our skin cells, we can make any kind of cell, well, not every kind of cell because that's super potent cells, but almost all, including sperm. And so we're obviously consciously evolving now, and we've got the tools to do it. It's not just fantasy or thought. And so for me, assistive device art and device art in general can help us kind of understand and have a prototyping of realities that we would like to incorporate in the future of human bodies. And we're doing it already, but doing it more consciously as to how to incorporate new senses, specifically sensorial for my specific interests, but in general. So the plasticity of mind and the sensory substitution devices is a field that I've been working in a lot. So creating devices that replace one sense with the other in order to better understand cross-modal psychology and how we perceive in general, and what other senses we can integrate into our physiology, and trying to understand how we actually perceive, and whereas organs are kind of sensors that we can just plug and play with, and our brain is really synthesizing all of that information. And so Paul Baccarita, who is one of the fathers of sensory substitution, said we see with our eyes, not with our brains.
The other way. We see with our brains.
Up, yeah. That's why I have you to read for me in my slides. Thank you so much. Yeah, so it's actually really interesting, this problem. It's Molyneux's problem from 1688, which wasn't really answered with experimental science until 2011, which is kind of insane, you know, a problem that has lasted this long. And the problem goes like this: if a person was congenitally blind, in other words, was born blind, and they knew a ball only by all the sensory modalities except for sight. So they could know what it smells like, what it feels like, what it's kinesthetic kind of perception, and you know, they know what it sounds like when it bounces on the floor, etc. Could this person, if they suddenly gain sight, be able to recognize that it's a ball? Do you think that they could, suddenly they gain sight, they see a ball, would they be able to recognize it just by sight alone? No? Yes? Yes? No? Okay.
Not for a while.
Yeah, so they would first have to integrate the information. And so it takes 10 minutes for this person to not only touch it, feel it, and have it, you know, have all of these experiences of the ball, and then see it to really, you know, have it placed far away from them and recognize it again. And So this tells you about how the process of perception is a learning process, and so it's an integrative process that takes time for us to understand and synthesize the reality. Paul Baccarita, who is the guy that said that we can see with our brains, invented this interface called the tongue display unit, and he began by making a matrix that he would put in the back, which he's holding in this black and white picture, and he had glasses with a camera, and the camera would film, you know, the environment that he's seeing at the moment. Then that would be, well, I think it was black and white already in that time. And then that would then be translated onto this matrix of solenoids, and so he could feel protrusions of the black and white image in the back of his on his back. And then he turned that into a tongue display unit, which uses electrodes, and so essentially you could see with your tongue. And what was incredible about this is not only for visually impaired subjects, but also for people with vestibular disbalance, so people who can't keep their, who have vertigo. I don't know if you've heard, but sometimes when people take what is it called? Antibiotics, sometimes it can affect their inner ear and it can cause deafness, but it could also cause vertigo because of our inner ear, the way that our inner ear works. We have 3 semicircular canals filled with fluid, and inside of that, those canals, there's kind of like cilia, little hairs that move around. And so it's essentially a gyroscope. I don't know how many of you are electronics people, but essentially, as you move like this, you have X, Y, and Z, and so that's what tells you, you know, gives you an idea of where you are within gravity, right? So where gravity is. And so what they did is they made this helmet with a gyroscope, which is the electronic component that works exactly the same way, and then translated that into information on the tongue display unit. And Cheryl would wear this, and it would help her little by little to regain her balance. It turned out that after some time, she could wear it for 10 minutes and go weeks without wearing the device. So essentially what happened there is that with brain plasticity, she was able to retrain her brain to look for cues in her tongue for gravity instead of using the vestibular system. So for assistive device art, which is a term I made up, it's the idea of cross-modal psychology, assistive technology, and interactive art and design. And so it includes, you know, playful self-discovery and, you know, the idea of human expansion and how can we enhance our, you know, how can we live more vividly, right? How can we experience the world more, essentially. And so doing this through brain plasticity prototypes and transformation of ability and perception, cross-modal psychology, visual spatial skills, and experimentation and testing through interactive art, as well as utility, for example, using using these interfaces for sonic vision if they were necessary. So assistive device art is a framework by which to classify, design, and evaluate technology within the cross-section of assistive technology and art. It is a method by which to innovate on digital display technology while deeply investigating structures of empirical contemplation and facilitating a way of reflecting on our perception through physical and sensory extensions. Assistive device art takes inspiration from atypical physiologies with the aim of creating perceptual models that provide a new shared experience from a multimodal mediated perspective. So I definitely take inspiration from alternative architectures of physiology. People who can't see have a different architecture to compensate for that sense loss or, you know, lack of. And so I take inspiration from what mechanisms they develop in order to navigate the world And usually it's novel experiences that sighted people don't have access to. ADA presents cognitive prosthetics that provide an experiential sensory transformation that instigates participants to contemplate on what constitutes skill and ability, on the plasticity of our condition as human bodies, and our relationship to technology. So what is skill and ability? Again, we talk about disability, but we don't talk about the alternative abilities that people with disabilities have. And also investigating this idea of the plasticity of our human condition in general, right? So kind of broadly speaking, where are we going? How are we redesigning our bodies? Being driven by this total and absolute desire to experience. Because in my mind, evolution is not just about adaptability. It makes no sense that in a single environment or in the same environment, there's many life forms that are created. There has to have been some other factor that made different life forms develop. And so that to me is total desire, which I was very glad to hear Eros in your talk, because I agree completely. This desire of maybe soaring through the skies, ends up turning into wings, whereas a desire to reach and grasp something turns into a hand. And so while this is like very slow evolutionary desire being transposed from one designer to another, as we used to naturally evolve, now that we are conscious of our evolution, desire is going to bring about a lot more diversity, of course, but it's still nonetheless still driven by desire. And this art reimagines our future bodies, proposing new avenues for human-computer integration, often camouflaging itself as a consumer product, indulging the illusion of escaping our experiential reality. So for me, it's really important to disguise this kind of work, or not disguise it, but to make it accessible to a general public, to make it look like design, to make it look like a product, because I'm interested in measuring how far we are willing to change our physiology, or what we are willing to kind of experience as a species in general. And then it measures the public's willingness to engage with assistive technology. So I've made some prototypes within this idea, and I recreated the tongue display unit from Paul Baccarita because I wanted to experience what it's like to see with your tongue. It's a really crappy resolution in comparison, so it doesn't do it justice, but I just wrote a little computer program to see what it's like to see with your tongue. What I found is that it's essentially reading Braille with your tongue. It's not like a magic picture appears in your brain after you put this thing flat in your tongue. You have to use the tip of your tongue and kind of scroll through, and then make, a visual spatial, recreation of this image in your brain. So very similar to what Braille would be, or something like this. I also was inspired by Daniel Kish, who is blind, and he also does a lot of echolocation to navigate space. And he rides bikes and does insane things that you would think, being blind, you would probably not be able to do. But with his ability to echolocate by tongue clicking, he's able to, engage in many activities. Oh, the picture is so pixelated. I'm sorry about that. This is the Echolocation Headphones, which is, it has a matrix of ultrasonic transducers, and so it's a speaker, but it has a it uses ultrasound to create audible sound. And so what that does is that it creates a very small focused sound wave, almost like a laser. And so you can essentially have a finger by which to feel the protrusions of space, but with sound, right? So it's very different than omnidirectional sound, because as I'm speaking, you can hear it in the back of me, you can hear it through all sides. But with ultrasound being, by having two ultrasonic sound waves, one of them being a carrier wave that then gets demodulated in space, you can create a very focused sound beam. And so this allows for a sighted person to do echolocation much easier. So essentially it's an assistive device for sighted people to learn how to echolocate. So to have a skill that blind people already kind of develop on their own. And it was also inspired by these World War II listening devices, or World War I, sorry, where we didn't have radar technology, but we had bomber planes, and so soldiers would have to sit in these really beautiful contraptions. I'm sure it wasn't fun, but it looks nice for me. And so they would sit here and listen for planes coming in. And so here you can see kind of an example of how the sound is a smaller sound wave because it's being made by ultrasound, which is then made audible in mid-air and then by reflecting off of a surface and then becomes omnidirectional sound. But the origin of the sound doesn't seem like it's coming from you, it seems like it's coming from the place in which you're being reflected. Also made an interface for smelling time. It's called Scent Rhythm, and I divided the day between the 24-hour day between rise, alert, unwind, and doze, 6-hour periods. And so the idea is that this is a chemo reception watch that puts you on time rather than just gives you time, playing with the idea that, if you need to get some caffeine in the middle of the day or something like this, but also playing with the fact that, our circadian rhythm and all of this is also very much chemical sense. And I also made this listening through your teeth interface, which is called a play grill, mixing kind of rap and science a bit. So we can hear through our teeth because through bone conduction, because a speaker and a motor are essentially the same electrical component, except one of them has a membrane that vibrates the air, and so then the air is vibrating at the same frequency. And then it vibrates your I forgot the name, timpano. And so then you can hear it, and so it vibrates then your inner ear bones. But with a motor, it's essentially, and it's an electromagnet, and so you can connect a sound output to it, and that will vibrate your teeth to the same frequency of sound that will then vibrate your inner ear bones in the same way. And this was a second interface that I made that was a little bit, trying to design a button for the tongue. It's really difficult to design buttons for the tongue because you don't have a bone, which is actually, if our fingers didn't have a bone, you couldn't press anything. It would just kind of like do what your tongue does. And it's very hard. So I still wasn't successful, even though, because of the size as well, I think. So, and you can't just make a conductive thing because the entire environment is wet. So designing for the mouth is a very big challenge, but it's doable. And another project to present is here is Iruka Tact, which is a parallel sense of touch underwater. I created this interface that uses a sonar, and so an ultrasonic rangefinder, and then it uses this information to translate it to water being propelled onto the volar pads of the fingers. Here you can see better how the water comes in with an impeller, so a propeller pushes out, an impeller suctions, and so it suctions the water from the environment and it propels it onto the volar pad of the finger at different speeds, and depending on how far there are objects underneath, an idea of being able to sense things underwater. So essentially, I think we somehow need to incorporate ultrasound into our physiology from as I'm thinking about all of these devices that I'm making and what it is that is really making it work. I did a lot of experiments in pools to try to see just exactly how we sense, how we feel with this probe, with this assistive device art. And so during my PhD, a lot of the work was psychophysical evaluation, psychophysical studies, which you know, was interesting because as an artist, having to prove that your art works is very bizarre. But for me, in my concept, in my work, it makes sense. And so psychophysics has become kind of a field of study for me as well. And going back to the vestibular system, this project is not sensory substitution, but straight up, you know, invasive. It's a remote control for your friends, and it uses a galvanic vestibular stimulator, which is essentially just passing 1 milliamp from one mastoid to the other. And by doing that, you can trick your cilia instead of, you know, being susceptible to gravity. You can control somebody, you know, by tricking them with electricity. And so electricity current has a directional, it's in DC, and so direct current. And so as a person is walking, you know, obviously with this talk you may gather that, you know, the sense of balance has information from a lot of the inputs, you know, eyesight being one of them, the vestibular system being another, and just in general, kinesthetic sense, you know, and proprioception, where you are in relation to your own body. But if you close your eyes and you walk and you're wearing this device, if you are pushing electricity from one side to the other, you will compensate thinking that gravity has shifted and start walking in the opposite direction. And so I don't know if this is going to play because I have no internet, but I have a video that... Yeah? Look how young I am, oh my God. 10 years ago. So he's wearing this device, and I've crossed the control so that you could simulate even though the electricity is going in the other direction. But you can see, obviously, I can't do anything about the tree because the tree has so much more information than just, you know, that 1 milliamp passing through. But essentially, you can see that we're very easy to control. Another project that I worked on in collaboration with Hilal and a few other artists in Turkey was Love at First Swab, which was a genetic matchmaker. And the idea was to use the HLA genes, which code for immunity, because there was a T-shirt experiment in the 70s that made some men wear T-shirts for like 7 days straight, and then women had to smell these T-shirts and find which one they were the most attracted to. And it turns out that their HLA genes were very diverse, so the women would choose, you know, partners with a very different HLA genes. And so we thought that we would take 23andMe data and, you know, scour kind of their HLA genes and then compare. This project never really worked because we were doing it at a time where it was in 2015, and 23andMe and the US was kind of going through trying to figure out how to do the health aspect of their interface, because it's technically would be kind of a diagnostic tool, so they were getting around the legal things about that. And in Turkey, this wasn't even a thing. And so, and one of the partners started working for Google, so I was like, stop, you know, we shouldn't work on this anymore, because they'll own the idea and that could be dangerous. And lastly, I wanted to show you some work that I do at the University of Texas Medical Branch. Innovating at the hospital is very difficult. Here's a map on how you do it. You essentially start with a prototype, and then you have to disclose it to the Office of Technology Transfer, which usually starts a provisional patent process, which takes a year, and then you take your idea through research, which then has to be reviewed by an internal review board, which is comprised of a lot of medical doctors and nurses and other medical professionals, as well as ethicists and community leaders and members. And then, of course, you do your pilot and study and publication, and hopefully by then you can patent something or put it in the open source. A lot of times if you let your provisional patent lapse and you publish, it's in the public domain, so we've done that for a lot of our devices. So we 3D print things, and we also work with respiratory therapists. Here's a project that we made, which is a surgery simulation liver gallbladder model. And this is in order to kind of cut costs because a current simulation model for a cholecystectomy is $200, and then is one-time use. So we're trying to make reusable models so that we can have better trained surgeons. Don't you think that's a great idea? And so we've managed to make it 80% cheaper, which is, who doesn't like an 80% discount, and it's reusable. And so the subsequent models will cost a lot less than that. We also made a blood mixing koozie. So there are very silly problems in the hospital, you know. We have, for example, a NICU ward, which is the neonatal intensive care unit, which is where all the newborn babies are. And when they take a blood sample from something so small, or someone so small, they have to do it with these microtubes. And so they prick their heel, it's called a heel stick, and then they take one drop at a time. And the SOP, which is the standard operating procedure, says that you have to cap the sample and shake it and mix it with the anticoagulant that's already in the tube. Nobody does this. You have a crying baby, you know, the stakes are high, you're taking blood from their, you know, tiny foot, and people just don't follow the standard operating procedure, which means that when you get the samples back at the lab, they're coagulated, and so they have to do it all over again. And this results in patients having, you know, a lot of bruising and, you know, patience, right? So Chris Zanner, who's a professor in pathology and at the time was in charge of coagulation, designed this koozie, which is just a vibrating motor and a battery. And then you put it in, you know, you put the microtube in, and as you're drawing each drop, it creates a microvortex and mixes with the anticoagulant automatically. The thing about this is that while this is a perfect device that's very simple, cheap to produce, in order for it to go into the market, it needs to be, you know, the market size needs to be big enough, and the people who you have to convince to implement it and integrate it is a lot. And so at the end of the day, even though this is a perfectly great idea, cheap, and it would save a lot of pain, it's still not a viable product because it doesn't make a lot of money. So the medical complex in the United States is very much driven by money rather than health, and so my position is a perfect place to experiment this or experience this. We also take CT scans and MRI data, and we 3D printed to make tangible prototypes for patients to see what their aneurysm looks like. And maybe it's a better convincing tool than showing them an MRI or a CT scan that they can hardly understand. And so this is also good for surgery simulation or surgery preparation. A lot of times I've worked with maxillofacial surgeons that, you know, before going into surgery will print the fracture of the jaw, or like, you know, we also, at the University of Texas Medical Branch, we're a teaching hospital, and we also take care of all the prison population of the entire state of Texas. So a lot of times we have people that, you know, somebody hit them with a bat, you know, and so, you know, we'll see fractures like that. So I've printed orbital bones and maxillofacial structures so that they can mold the plaques onto these models before surgery, and that cuts surgery time a lot, saving money for the hospital as well as saving surgery time, which can avoid a lot of complications. And lastly, at the lab, we made URUS, which is a pressure cuff actuated emergency use resuscitator system. And we gained support from a lot of different agencies, including NIST and NASA. It was an incredible time where there was a call to action for all, I don't know, you probably have seen some initiatives here for ventilators during the pandemic when we saw this impossible triaging in Italy where they weren't going to ventilate people over 60. I think the world kind of just had this huge, massive need to create ventilators. And so we made our own, and we decided to make a pneumatic system. And so by using common equipment from the hospital, so we took a blood pressure cuff, the cuff that allows, that inflates and, makes pressure on your arm to measure your blood pressure. And then, just use some PVC valves and an Arduino. We thought everybody would have this around. And then by inflating it with the air and vacuum of the room, so we inflated. All hospital rooms have air and vacuum because they need to vacuum things, and also they need air for ventilators. And so we actuated this, so we, can make 400 milliliters of tidal volume at 30 breaths per minute, and 800 at, I can't remember exactly, but we essentially hit all the benchmarks that you need for proper ventilation. And we also made it an assist control system and not just a automated system. So essentially, if you're totally under and you can't breathe on your own, you're probably unconscious, so you will just use the automated system, which, respiratory therapists will just set it. Otherwise, if you are breathing, which was a lot of the patients that we were having during COVID, you need more pressure so that you can just help them finish the breath. And so we were using a component from Honeywell that was medical grade, which was the only component that was touching the patient other than the ambu bag, which is already a medical device that's being approved. And so that way we could push the air, so when the patient's trying to breathe, we just finish the breath for them. And so here's a drawing of all the components that it has. Usually ambu bags, are just manual, and they come with a pressure PEEP valve, and that is a pop-up valve so that it doesn't, you can set the pressure that you need to add to the patient, and you can also have a pop-off valve, so in case that you pressurize the patient too much, it'll just, open up and you won't blow up their lungs, which is important. And then, N95 filter, which is also very customary. And then, so it just has a knob for IE ratio, which is inspiration, expiration, which is actually really important. You'd think, whatever, they'll breathe and, but actually leaving time for expiration is extremely important because you will not be able to get rid of your CO2 if you don't exhale. So exhale deeply when you can, and remember. Control knob for tidal volume, for breaths per minute, and for the sensitivity of the inhalation that the patient is trying to, breathe. So we want to know how much the patient is able to breathe, so we can control the sensitivity for that. And lastly, we're currently on medical device, animal studies. So we're going to have 3 female sheep that we're going to, test this device on. So the prototype is fully functional at this point. And we will probably only test for the automated rather than the assist control. And I have the protocol here if you want to check it out. I don't know how we are in time, but you know, this would measure the safety, efficacy, and reliability. Our idea was to pass it through, you know, the FDA, through the emergency use authorization. I don't think that that's still in effect. Either way, we will complete the animal studies. We kind of had a deflating moment when we asked for funding in May and didn't get it until October. So, you know, interesting, right? It's an emergency. We actually, you know, bootstrapped the project for, you know, we must have, you know, shelled like $2,000 for it of our own pocket because it was an emergency at the time. But, you know, bureaucracy still persists regardless of the emergency. So we've been just taking our time ever since. And so we are still here. Hopefully, maybe we will be able to get FDA approval or not. It's still all open source. We did a provisional patent, and like I said, we let it lapse so that it's open source. And without further ado, thank you. And here's my contact.
Any questions?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And Adam, you want to? Yeah, please.
Danger.
No, I'm really kind of really impressed with the respirator project because initially I mean people were looking for bioartists and people that DIY bio people to track the virus. And I was like, what about making respirators? You know, people were coming up with new kinds of masks, and I got a really strong reaction that artists and DIY bio people can't make medical instruments like that because it's, you know, it's too dangerous. These things are actually in the lungs, etc. Like you were talking about, you can pop lungs. So I'm like, it's really brave to work in a hospital and try to come up with a tool that might actually be able to be used. And I'm like, don't you catch flack from people that are just like, yeah, but you're just an artist. You can't. You're not responsible enough to help people's lives.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I think that artists, we have kind of a bad rep or something like this. And I think it's just semantics, you know. Honestly, I'm there as a medical device prototyping lead and not as an artist, and I've slowly kind of carved my position to being more like an artist in residence. But my background is from art, and they know that. I think that, I mean, I got like a scientific award, COVID scientific award from the hospital because of this, and they also gave me the honorary position of professor in School of Medicine. So I think that maybe this is a self-imposed limit more than a reality. I think that what it takes is to be fearless and just do it. And I think that people are waiting for answers and people are waiting for solutions and people are willing to embrace these regardless of where it comes from. I think that, of course, it's a lot easier if you are, if you have a lot of paper, you know, credentials behind your name. But I mean, that being said, you know, I'm a professor in pathology now. I can spell pathology, but I mean, that's about it, you know? I mean, I consider it one of my greatest performance artworks so far, you know, making it as a professor of medicine, you know? I can't even believe it. But, you know, I mean, it just takes, like, doing it, you know, and just being fearless and you know, being humble to educate yourself where you are and to know that this is a collaborative process. And, you know, we're working with the head of respiratory therapy. We're working with, you know, engineers that have volunteered from all over the place. And I have to say, as an artist and as a prototyper first before a scientist or a properly reared engineer from the bottom up, I'm a top-down person. I mean, you know, it just, sometimes it's easier for people like that to come up with proper solutions, because if you're so caught up in the, in the way of doing things, then you won't really do anything new. Or you will make it so complicated at the beginning that you won't get anywhere, you need to be in the speed you need to be. So rapid prototyping takes creativity, curiosity, and fearlessness first. Yeah, so that's what I would say. Fear not, and just make it happen. Yes.